Welcome to Unleash Podcast. Our mission is to equip and inspire emerging leaders to take holistic approaches to lead themselves, their family, and the community. In this podcast, we will bring in expert insights to enrich your leadership journey. We are so glad you're tuning in, and let's unleash your leadership potentials.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Unleash Podcast and also webinar series. And today we have a very special guest joining us from US. His name is Mr. Os Guinness. And also today as a co-host, one of my board member of Asia Leadership Development Network, Mr. Scott Oman will be joining us. And this following dialogue and conversation about calling will be facilitated by Scott and I. And first, I would like to introduce Scott. Scott is a good friend of mine. I've known him over 10 years. We actually got to know each other in Shanghai. And he was my mentor, and also we became really good friends. And as I pursue my calling and started my non-for-profit, I asked Scott to consider to be one of my board member, and Scott accepted that invitation. And since then, we've been working closely to advance our mission and try to impact more leaders in Mongolia, but also in that part of the world. Thank you, Scott, for taking this offer, but also serving with me together at this podcast.
Thank you. Looking forward to today's conversation.
And also, I'd like to introduce Mr. Guinness. Os Guinness is an author and also a social critic, and he's written many books, over 30 books, and including one of the topic that today we'll be particularly talking about is on calling. As a matter of fact, his book was one of the first book I ever read about calling. It's calling about finding and fulfilling central purpose about your life. So thank you, Mr. Guinness, joining us today. And thanks for your time with us in advance.
Thank you for having me. What a privilege.
And I'd also like to take the opportunity to introduce the fourth person who's joining us in the conversation today. It's actually my father, Dick Oman. He has had an interesting work history, which I've had the pleasure and the honor of observing close up. He worked for many years in Boston in the financial services industry for Massachusetts Financial MFS, but then also had an interesting change in career and led and directed an insurance company in Philadelphia for about 5 years, and then subsequently retired and spent time working in a number of Christian nonprofit organizations. And so had a very interesting career path and will, I think, bring an interesting perspective to our topic today of calling. So, Dick, welcome. Glad you're here.
I'm happy to join you. Look forward to it.
All right. Let's jump into our conversation today. Well, I'll start with the question for Mr. Guinness. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself first? And are you related with Guinness beer founder family? And that's the first thing. Guinness is such a unique last name. Every time I see it, everybody think of that. So is that true? Tell us a little bit story. I also heard from my friend Scott and other people that your life actually started in Asia, close to where Mongolia is, close to where, that part of the world is. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, thank you for having me. A real privilege to be with you. Yes, I was born in just near Kaifeng in Хэрхэн, which is a little south of Mongolia. My grandparents were doctors in China, and both my parents were born there, and my brothers and I were born there. So a great privilege to come from Asia. I do come, as you thought, from an Irish family, and my great-great-great-grandfather founded the Guinness Brewery, and his is the signature on all of the bottles that are sent around the world. But actually, he came to faith in Jesus through the preaching of John Wesley in the Great Revival in the 18th century. So from then onwards, his faith in Jesus was at the heart of his business. And he not only led his business in a Christian way, but also was very well known for his generosity and his care for social things, all because of his being a follower of Jesus. So that's my family background.
Very good. And I think it'll be interesting to explore a bit as we get into the topic of calling, how, given that background, you've come to the career and the work that you've done. But we'll come back to that in a second. Perhaps let's delve into the topic of calling. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you would define calling. There's different ways you can come at it. The notion of calling, I think, is at one level very fundamental to the meaning of what it means to be human and human purpose. But at the same time, calling can also be seen as a bit of maybe a more Western thing. It's more individualistic. And so I think there's a number of things here that are important to kind of pull apart and examine before about the notion of calling, and then we can go from there. So if you could just talk a little bit about how you define calling.
Well, I would flatly disagree with the idea that it's a Western thing. But the way I define it is this, that when God calls us in Jesus, follow me, everything we are, everything we do, and everything we have now are given a dynamic and a direction and a devotion, because we're doing it in following Jesus. So it's all about following Jesus. Now, it is collective. All Christians are called. And it's also individual. Each of us is called individually. Now, the West may have emphasized the second, and Asia very naturally emphasizes the first, but the Bible emphasizes both. And Westerners need to correct their imbalance very often. But as I see it, it's at the heart of faith. So it begins with the call of Abraham in Genesis 12. God calls Abraham and a family and a nation. And now in Jesus, he's calling a whole new people. So it's at the very heart of our faith, as well as the heart of the faith of each individual one of us.
So interesting. You, in explaining calling, tie it very quickly to a grounding in a Judeo-Christian perspective. Maybe as we continue to explore calling, look for a minute at maybe alternate ways that calling has been described, perhaps from a more secular perspective. And could you talk a little bit about maybe that side of it and contrast what you've just described versus alternate views?
Well, I would argue that there's no calling without a caller.
Mm.
In other words, other people use the term because they're borrowing it. They're really parasites on the biblical view. Calling started with Abraham. Leave your country and your culture and your kin. That's the beginning of calling. And of course, it's most of all in the New Testament. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow me. Now, at the time of the Reformation, when it was rediscovered again and the dynamism broke out, people began to see that calling included the whole of life. So the word vocation, which is simply the Latin for calling, began to be used of your work, your occupation. And then people talked of calling just about their work. And so actually they borrowed the term, but it has no meaning at all unless you know the caller. And we've got to get back to seeing that. Now, of course, humans have purpose apart from the Bible and apart from Jesus. But I would say if you look at the big three families of faiths, the Eastern, Hinduism, Buddhism, there's no sense of calling at all, because freedom is freedom from individuality, not freedom to be an individual. Because when we take ourselves seriously as individuals, in the Hindu and Buddhist sense, you've got to renounce that. And just as water flows into the sea and salt disappears into water, so we've got to lose our identity. That's not the biblical way. The other contrast is with the atheist view, the secularist view. And you have there a kind of do-it-yourself universe. If you want meaning, there isn't any at all out there in the universe. Everything's come from chance. So if you want meaning, do it yourself. When I was a student, I had lectures from the great atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell. And his picture was always the Greek giant Atlas who carries the world of meaning on his own shoulders. Now that sounds great when you're young, healthy, and you've got plenty of money. But for most people, that's an incredibly weary view of life. We can't do it all ourselves, but the biblical view is wonderful. Calling means purpose comes when we rise to follow Jesus. So it's partly be who you are, made in the image of God, and it's partly become who you can become. As God calls you, you grow to be who he knows you can be. And there's no higher purpose than that.
Wow. So as you know, like most of our audience listening to our podcast and our webinar series are in Mongolia, that part of the world. The word calling translated into Mongolian as dуудлагаа. So dуудлагаа kind of have an idea. Basically, it means your name, your title. So that's the kind of meaning behind it in our language. Most of our audience in that part of the world also is a part of a culture from Central and East Asian culture. Family, community, and tribal and cultural root is important to us. How does calling speak to a culture like this that you have observed very uniquely?
Well, I'm glad you said that idea of calling is simple, because it's simple in English. You can think of, say, shouting to a friend over the street, or the call of a bird. That's the same word. But of course, everything changes. This is not a bird call, or this is not my calling to you across the street. This is God, our creator, calling to us. And that's what changes everything. So the basic idea is very simple. But of course, go back to Abraham. God called a person and his family. So as I said, the Westerners who take it in individualistic direction only, it's all about me, that's wrong. He calls us, none of us can be ourselves alone. We're all born in families. We live in neighborhoods. We're part of communities. We're part of nations. And so calling is collective as well as individual. So you think there are no two faces alike. There are no two snowflakes alike. God has an incredible created diversity. So yes, we're part of families, but each of us is also absolutely unique. And calling speaks to the collective, the community. All Christians together are called to be holy as our Lord is holy. We're all called together to be peacemakers as our Lord is peacemaking, and so on. So there are parts of it that are collective, and there are parts of it that are uniquely individual. You remember what the Lord says to Jeremiah, the prophet, before you were conceived, incredible, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you and appointed you a prophet to the nations. In other words, there is a collective, absolutely, but there's also a unique individuality to calling.
Dick, maybe you could, as we explore this topic of collective versus individual calling, what are your reactions to that based on your experience as you've gone through life and experienced calling or observed it in others?
I grew up in a Christian home where the gospel of Jesus, a certain notion of piety, personal piety, was very central. And so for me, my sense of calling came out of that background, not out of a broader background, sort of philosophical background. And so what it boiled down for me was, well, what are you going to do in life? What's your calling? What's your job? It didn't really negate the spiritual sense of it, but the practical practical sense was more what I focused on. What are you going to do? And so as I was growing up, going through school, grade school, high school, and even college, it was all focused on what am I going to end up doing? And for me, it was almost pre-decided in that my father was an immigrant, and he had built a business, a fairly successful business, and my role in life was to follow him, to continue the business that he had started. And so in that sense, my calling was very low level. What are you going to do? What's your vocation? And the interesting thing is I didn't think about the sacred aspect of it as much as I did the practical. As it turned out, after graduate school, I entered into the business, but very quickly found out that wasn't for me. Running a manufacturing operation is not me. And I very quickly shifted to a different job pursuit, and I got into the financial business. But up to that point, I had my faith over here and my job pursuit here. And I was thinking in those terms. It was interesting then because after a number of years in the financial business and a fair amount of success, I began to ask the question, what is the purpose of this all? Is it just that I'm going to be successful and can make a lot of money? Is there something more? Is there something more meaningful? So I began to ask questions that I really hadn't answered before. I'd been active in church, leadership in church. I've been on the board of Christian organizations, and I began to seriously consider, well, maybe I should shift. Maybe there was more meaning and purpose moving in that direction. And as it turned out, I didn't. And I think that was a wise thing. But the sacred aspect of calling, as opposed to just the secular, became much more important to me during that stage of my life. I have to admit that I could have benefited back then from Oz's thinking in the call, and seeing my purpose in life is living faithfully before God, regardless of what I did. I think some of my confusion would have gone away at that point, but that came later. So calling to me started out vocational. As I moved along in business pursuits, I began to ask the questions that I probably should have asked earlier. What is the purpose of all this? Why am I doing this? And I sort of inadvertently answered it by not doing anything about it. But it began to say to me that my business pursuits, my vocational pursuits, were nothing more than a gateway into God's greater purposes for me. And that was my calling. And that gets around to what I was saying.
So I have a next question for Mr. Guinness. How did you discover your calling in your life? And then how do you practically discover your calling as young men and women today that you have advice for them?
Well, of course, the major thing is to read the Gospels and see what it is that Jesus is calling us to. Now, just take a couple of points from that. One, he is Lord. Now, that means he's Lord over every inch of everything we do in life. Well, take a second thing that our Lord says. He calls us to be salt and light out into the world. And those are symbols of engagement and penetration. Now, I say that because calling sometimes gets distorted. It gets shrunk down to something purely personal or purely spiritual, as if that's all it is. So when I came to Christ, Dick and I are the same age. We're obviously the oldest on the podcast. much older than many of you are following Jesus in Mongolia, I came to Christ in 1960, 60 years ago. The teaching was almost there in England that if you were all out for Jesus, you really had to be a minister, a missionary, or an evangelist. Now, later on, I discovered that teaching is wrong. What it should be, it's everyone, everywhere, in everything. So we can be called to be doctors and lawyers and teachers and mothers and all sorts of things. And the idea that the spiritual is higher than the secular is really wrong. So it was a while before I discovered good teaching and fought my way out of the bad teaching. And it liberated me because I wasn't cut out to be a minister or an evangelist or a missionary. And when I discovered the freedom to be who God had made me to be, it was incredibly liberating. And actually, this happened in the 1960s, which in the Western world was a very turbulent, crisis-ridden decade. And I was thrilled to be able to discover that as a Christian, I could engage with this, get into it and understand it. And that's out of that, I wrote my first book and got launched in trying to understand culture and to see what it was to be faithful to Christ in this crazy modern world in which we're living. So I would stress that simple idea: everyone, everywhere, in everything. Calling is not spiritual only.
Would you, moving kind of through that and hearing a little bit, both of you talk about your experience with calling through your life, would you say that calling can change? Does it kind of go through phases? So is calling a kind of a one-off burst of inspiration that proceeds for a lifetime, or do you see it moving and changing based on your own experience?
Yes.
Well, does the call of Jesus change? No. Follow me, and we follow. We are followers of Jesus. So that is the one continuing, constant call, the call of Jesus. Now, you can do all sorts of things. I'm a father and a citizen and a husband and a writer. There are all sorts of different parts of my calling, but I'm doing them all in following Jesus. So I'll put it differently. You know, in the old days in the traditional world, people did one thing almost all their lives. Now people talk of a portfolio career. You do this, you do that, you do the other. People are doing all sorts of things, but they're all linked together for us as followers of Jesus. They are all following Jesus. So the call doesn't change. Our understanding of it may deepen, but it's the same call: follow me. From the day we start out following Jesus to the day we die, and then the privileges, for the first time, we no longer just hear him, we actually see him.
I would have to say, from a practical point of view, I did not have the clarity that Os has presented here on the call. And as I reflect back, my call did change, but it shouldn't have. And only later did I find out that there was a central call that encompassed everything. So it changed for me, but it shouldn't have.
Maybe one other thought that comes to mind for me, actually, as I think about calling. There's a certain thrust behind, or a kind of I guess you could call it a righteousness or perceived righteousness around calling, and I guess that can come through, particularly, as we said, Os, as you mentioned, in earlier days or in past decades, where calling, at least within the Christian community, was very closely tied with, calls to being a missionary or being a minister. But with that high calling, it can potentially lead you into dangerous places. Because you can use that high calling to justify things that wouldn't necessarily be the right thing to be doing, right, from a moral standpoint. So how do you avoid some of the, how would you avoid some of those pitfalls possibly? Because we can see people with, claiming a high call, then going to, very bad places potentially.
Well, every biblical truth has a dark side because we're all sinners. In other words, there's a good side of it and there's a potential bad side. And so clearly, the wonder of calling is the miracle of grace, that God, who knows us, each of us, called us because he loves us and has a purpose for us. If he knew the depth of our hearts, surely other people would turn away from us. But the Lord calls us and loves us. That's the wonder of it. Now, the shadow side, the dangerous side of that, is arrogance and conceit. And you can see sometimes in history that calling has led people to have a very conceited view. They're very full of themselves because God has called them. And they use the call of God to justify all the things they want to do and give themselves pride and dignity and puff themselves up. And that's very dangerous. So we need to be grateful for God's call, and we need to be humble in God's calling. And beware, Christians should be the most realistic people. All of us sin. We all go wrong. We all need forgiveness. We all need challenging. That's what fellowship and friendship is all about, correcting. But we need to be aware of the dangers of calling as well as the great privileges.
It's interesting that, Mr. Guinness, when you were talking about 60s, when you were young, to hear about that. We also know today's mission world, like places like Mongolia, places like unreached and unchurched people places, they are importing whatever the Western missionary bring them. So it's a similar kind of consequences of that is basically today in Mongolian church are some of the concept people are breathing are the exact concept that 60s or 70s or much earlier days, the missionaries, when they grew up, understood, they brought that cultural concept to the church. Mm-hmm. So if you talk to churches in Mongolia, you said, well, I want to be, my calling to be a businessman. Most likely 9 out of 10 people around you think that is crazy. You shouldn't, you're basically wasting your life and you're going out pursuing the world. Only, there is in the church, there's more holy higher calling, which is being a pastor and a missionary. That's it. Rest of the people you are not called. So do you have any comment on that?
No, you're making a very important point. Obviously, all of us are partly shaped by the people who introduced us to Jesus. But we always have to ask, is the gospel they give us all the fullness of the gospel that we see in the Bible and in Jesus? So, my own dear parents were missionaries. And you can see how part of the Chinese church was shaped by, say, 19th, 20th century Christian mission that often was a little more shrunk than they realized. And one of the things often missing was calling. Now, if you go back in history, the Bible has this idea of everyone, everywhere, in everything. The lawyer, as well as the pastor, the teacher and the doctor, as well as the missionary. But that shifted in the Catholic centuries. And if you look up a Catholic dictionary on vocation and calling, it's defined as joining the priesthood. The Reformation went back to the Bible. You remember the principle sola scriptura, scripture alone. They went back to the Bible and they rediscovered the calling of everyone, not just the priesthood of all believers, but the calling of all believers everywhere. And so the Reformation said work was valuable. And that's actually, scholars say, gave rise to modern capitalism. Everything you did was valuable. William Tyndale, who was the first man who translated the Bible into common English, not Latin, he talked about washing the dishes as a part of calling. Martin Luther, who married a nun once she'd been coming out of the Catholic Church, he said that diapers, changing diapers was a part of calling. In other words, Everything is a part of our calling when we're doing it as unto the Lord. So I'd encourage you, wonderful young Christians in Mongolia, everything you do, if you have the gifts to be an athlete or a farmer or a doctor or a teacher or an incredible businessman, God's made you with those gifts, and your calling is to be who the Lord has made you to be. So don't listen to anyone who tells you it's more spiritual to be a pastor. No, if God's given you the gifts of a pastor, be a pastor. But if God's given you the gifts of being a businessman, like Dick is a great businessman, be a businessman.
Wow. Thank you.
Maybe both Oz and Dick, on that topic, for the young people who will be listening to this, what would be some, based on your own experience, practical tips of how you discover what your calling is as you get ready to launch into maybe the first stage of your career? Maybe Dick maybe you could start.
For me, I think it was trial and error to find out what the gifts are that God had given me. And it took a process. I mean, I began to think, well, my sort of route in life is to follow my father in the business that he started. Until I actually got into it, I didn't have a sense of, well, that wasn't really my skill set. And I had to learn that. So I think finding out those things that you're really fit to do is a process. It isn't something that you just intuitively know and pursue it. For some, that's true. But I think for a lot of people, it isn't. One thing that strikes me is that by separating vocations between secular and sacred, there's a safety aspect of it. If the secular is different, you actually hold yourself to a lower standard than you would in the sacred. Whereas the view that Oz is talking about, it's no difference. You live to the same goals regardless. You get no pass in business just because it's business as opposed to the sacred. But I think that's a learning process. I didn't intuitively know it. It took me time. I'm thankful that God worked with me to direct me where I should go.
Now, Scott, I would say that Dick's answer in terms of trial and error is a very important answer. I would begin by first reminding ourselves that we're looking at the individual part of calling, not the collective. We must never forget the collective, which many people do. But even when we take the individual part, for many people, for most people in history, they couldn't choose. In other words, people just had to do what their fathers and grandfathers, their mothers and grandmothers did. There was no choice. It takes a certain level of prosperity, now coming to much of Asia, where people can truly choose. But we've got to realize that is actually a privilege. Now you see in the New Testament, take say Paul, he talks about slaves. They had no choice at all. They did even their slavery as a part of calling to the Lord, not to their master. So we've got to be clear. We're talking about people who have a choice. So I would say, as Dick did, we've got to start by reading the scriptures. What is the call as the New Testament tells us? And then, as Dick said, think through. You might think over a matter of a few months, what are the gifts that God has given you? What are you good at? What are the things that make you really happy when you're doing it? Some of us are good with our hands. Some of us are good with our mouths. Some are leaders. Some are technically brilliant. Other people are good with caring for people. They're people, and so on. We're all gifted in different ways. So think of yourself and what you love doing and really gives you joy, and write it down. The gifts you think God has given you. Well, think and pray about that. And at a certain point, share the list with your closest Christian friend. Now, most times people will say, of course, that's obvious. Those are you. Sometimes they'll say, what? You really think that? That's not you at all. Anyway, we need to have a bit of comeback. So it's not just us, but then, as Dick said, you have that stage of trial and error. So I think with many young Christians, their 20s are the decade in which you have that trial and error. You think there are 6 things you might do. You try 3 or 4 of them, this isn't me. And eventually you get clearer as to what really is you. In the West, we have a problem. It's called the midlife crisis. Someone who calls himself a square peg in a round hole. And when they get to the middle of their life, they feel, I don't want to do this the rest of my life. They've never thought through the calling at the beginning. That's what we've got to do. So think through giftedness in the light of the Gospels, and then share it with a friend for some comeback. And then, as Dick said, that period of trial and error until you get clearer and closer to what is the heart of who you know you are and God has made you to be. Now, as Rick Warren said in his huge bestseller, it's not about you or me. It's always about him. So we're discovering our giftedness, but to serve Jesus and to serve God.
I can't help myself. There's an interesting aspect of what both of you describe, which is this idea that early in life, identify what you think your skills and talents are. It might lead to a number of options, which in that early stage you're experimenting with, and we've all done that. But that opens up the possibility of actually trying something and failing. And I know, at least from my own exposure to living in Asia and Asian culture, this idea of trying and failing and the shame that comes with it is not a good thing. And oftentimes, particularly in places where I've been, in China and other places that have been going through over the past several decades of upward mobility, oftentimes the parents will say, well, from whatever my beginnings that I came from, my son or my daughter is going to be a doctor or going to be a lawyer, and they've got to be successful at that because that's going to be very prestigious and earn lots of income. And so a lot of times that path is set. So that runs a little bit counter to some of the things you're advising, and I'm just interested in your perspective on that. Again, maybe Oz, start with you and then back to Dick.
Well, I said the downside of a Western individualism is that calling becomes conceit. The downside of the Asian sense of the collective is that calling becomes performance. And you're doing it before your family, before your parents, before society. So our Western world is very individualistic. The Asian world has a much greater sense of face, the Chinese word face, and shame. Now, calling is actually different from both of those. Who are we called by and called to live before? I put it this way. We are called to live before one audience, the audience of one. So we have a lot of other audiences. I'm a writer. I'd be a failure if I didn't have at least 2 readers. Doctors need patients. You need business clients, Scott, Dick, and so on. And we all have audiences, but who is our final audience? So you're not there to please your parents. You're not there to impress your culture. You're there to please the Lord. So what is success? Success is when the Lord says at the end of life, well done. Terrible teaching grew up in the West 20 years ago that we've all got to think of our legacy. In other words, you get to 50, 60 or whatever, you think, what is it that I've done, achieved, and I'm passing on to my son or daughter so I can know what my life's added up to? We don't know. That's nonsense biblically. The only test of success is well done, good and faithful servant. So we've got to say again and again, we will fail. After all, the greatest things we're aiming at are beyond our reach. That's Hebrews 11. People who act into history, but they're looking over the edge of history and they have vision and venture. So not all that we hope for will happen in our lives. but we're still doing it. And Hebrews 11 says, God is proud of people who live by faith like that, and he's prepared a city for them. So we're not interested in success, how much money you've made or how famous you've become, or whether all your friends think you're terrific. The only audience that matters is the Lord saying, well done.
Well, I was just going to add that the question was determinate. So, in other words, is something prescribed for you? And that was my case. You know, I was expected to follow in and run the family business. And it wasn't necessarily a spiritual exercise, but I found out that it wasn't me. It was part of how I was made. And it was a traumatic break to have to say, no, I'm going to do something else. Thankfully, it was graciously accepted by my father, and I could move on. Only later did I find out that I then moved into a position where my faith could grow to a fullness that it couldn't have elsewhere. And then I began to, after that, reap the spiritual benefits.
I can't help to think, Os, when you were young, the motivation behind you writing this book on calling. What made you to start to write that? There might something that you have observed in that situation, in that time in the history, that God convicted you, but also you probably saw a generation that you wanted to write a book. What was it?
Well, there are really a whole number of reasons, but basically two broad ones. If we think of the Christian faith, calling is at the heart of its personal intimacy, follow me, but from Abraham right down to today, it's also at the heart of its public relevance and the way the Christian faith has put a stamp on history as people have followed God and served his purpose in their generation. So the cross, you could say, is more important, but calling is second only to the cross in putting its stamp on history, deeply personal, but incredibly public and cultural too. Then on the personal level, for me, there were two other reasons. One was calling liberated me. I didn't have to be what everyone else thought I had to be. I could be free to become what God had made me to be. But then that was why I got into the whole notion. But then I saw a lot of other people were confused too. I can't tell you how many people, I get emails, letters every month of people. I thought I'd have to become a minister and go to seminary. And thank God I read your book and I was free to become a politician or to become a businessman and so on. So it's been incredibly helpful in freeing other people to be who God made them to be. So that's why I wrote the book.
Maybe let me shift gears a little bit again. There was something earlier that I think, Os, you may have mentioned about calling and different roles that we all play at any point in our lives. I think you said that, someone can be called, as you were, to be a writer or a commentator on social and cultural trends, a philosopher. But at the same time, you had a role as a father, as a husband. There's a multiplicity of callings that are tied to roles. It's not just one calling at any one time that does, covers everything else. There's actually at any point in time possibly a multiplicity of callings that you have to balance. Could you comment on that a little bit? Because there's kind of this one calling at one time that is not necessarily true, it sounds.
Well, it's a multiplicity of spheres, but it's still the one call, follow me. Martin Luther said it very clearly. I mean, he was a disciple of Jesus. He was a theologian. Then he became a husband. Then he became a father. And he was always a citizen of his part of Germany, and so on. In other words, he wore all these different hats, as we say in the West. But they're not different callings, they're just different parts of our lives that are all part of our following his calling. It's our central calling, if we're faithful and serve the Lord in our areas, whatever they are, we bring glory to the Lord. By the way, husbands love their wives. By the way, Christians act in their communities. By the way, doctors heal, you name it. So we think every part of our life should be bringing glory to the Lord. You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic at the moment. I love the fact, you look at the early church, there were several times, there were no preachers, of course, in the big modern sense of writers like C.S. Lewis or evangelists like Billy Graham. But again and again, the pagans said, "Great is the God of the Christians." Why? Because they saw the Christian faith in action, in love. So, for example, in the great disease of 169, called the Plague of Garland, there was no medicine, no vaccines, so people just got out, and the medicine was running, as one philosopher said. But Christians stayed and cared and risked their lives, and some died. But others, oddly enough, developed antibodies through staying and were stronger in future plagues. But above all, they showed the compassion and love, feeding and caring for the poor and the sick. And the pagans say, "Great is the God of the Christians." We're called to so live that people can glorify our Father.
That, go ahead, Balu.
I can't wonder to think, just based on the direction you're thinking, if we are ministers and we are shepherds of people, I believe in the concept of coaching, help people to discover their potentials and all of that, not call people to do what we are called to do. I think too much of the time I observe even that part of the world or this part of the world, I feel like a lot of church leaders are not helping people who inside the church to uncover or unfold their calling and then equip them and send them out. Rather, we want them to come and just stay here so they see my calling and then just consume on it. Do you have any comments on that?
Any project that takes more than one generation requires transmission. In other words, it needs to be handed on. And you use the word coach. I think the word discipling is actually deeper in the sense, if you go back to the Greeks, Socrates had a disciple, Plato, two of the greatest thinkers in the Western world. But in the same way, Jesus, Mark 3 says, Jesus chose 12 to be with him to be sent out. And people think, well, that was their privilege being with him. Of course, they were chosen to be sent out. No. The discipling was learning from him even more than he could put into words. Because that's the heart of discipling. There's more to knowing than knowing knows. So you can't put everything in words. You can't put it in a book. You can't put it in a sermon. You can't put it in a coaching manual. You have to live and model yourself on someone who's doing it well, a great pianist or a great sportsman or a great leader or a great Christian pastor. And so we've got to have young people open our lives to them, but in order to send them out, praying and hoping they will do much more than we have. No, we don't want them to be clones of us. We want them to go on and to grow deeper and go further than we did. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. So we're nothing great. And we're challenging people to learn the little we know and then to go out and do far more with it than we've ever done.
I might add one point to that. I was more influenced by watching Christians live out their lives in their professions than I was by anything I have been taught. I watched people. Thankfully, I had Christians around me or in the same business area that I was, and they didn't come up and necessarily tell me things, but I watched them and I saw things that then I could replicate. So that's to Oz's point. You can only transmit so much by words. There's a lot just living that you pick up things that become very, very important to you.
You know, the rabbis have a wonderful way of putting it, Malahu. I don't know if this translates into Mongolian, but the rabbis say, we don't just need textbooks, we need text people.
Yeah, and, you know, that makes me think of the importance of family. Dick, as you were talking, knowing that we're father and son, I think as you think we discuss role and are reflecting on it here, certainly for me, just the importance of the relationship we shared and in observing you as I grew up and the importance of family as a place where that discipleship happens just strikes me as, you know, exactly right. A family is a place where a father and a mother, through their ongoing example, can demonstrate to their kids how to strike the importance of calling, both in talking about it explicitly, but just modeling it. And then getting back to what we talked about, you know, as well, just the multiplicity of roles that fall under this call of following Jesus and how that plays out in life. So family is super important in being able to, as a place where that happens.
I mean,
So
certainly in my personal, yeah. Go ahead, Dick.
I was just going to say that's ground zero in modeling family.
Certainly in my personal experience as well, you know, in marketplace or in my personal life, two areas of my life I actually struggle most in terms of my spirituality, but also my character is my home and then also workplace. Those are the place I have to not talk the talk. I have to live the talk. And that's when it gets to much more different than what I just preach about. I have to live out the gospel. I have to be very different, have a different expectation for myself, and I have to model it differently. So I kind of appreciate, you know, Scott and Richard, you know, you kind of brought up that part of the consideration as well.
Let me put the question a bit differently. In talking about calling and some of the more mundane things of life, being a spouse or being a parent, does that seem to be a bit of a lost art, or, you know, it has the notion of calling in those areas perhaps diminished and needs to be brought back in a way that would be beneficial broadly across society? Do you think that's an issue?
I think that's a very important point you're making, because just as we tend to think calling is spiritual and not secular, so we tend to think that calling is the big areas of life and not the little areas. So it should cover the humdrum and the menial and the very down to earth, because life does. Now, I said with Martin Luther, it's changing diapers, or William Tyndale, it's washing the dishes, or with a famous book by Brother Lawrence, it was being around the kitchen. In other words, much of life is filled with very little things. And I love the saying of Hudson Taylor, the great missionary to China: a little thing is a little thing, but faithfulness in a little thing is a big thing. Mm-hmm. And that's what it means to do our calling, including the little things, as unto him.
I think you talked about the cultural changes, Scott. I think one of the problems in today's world is the seeming breakdown in the family. And if the family is important in transmission of God's call, then families that break up have difficulty communicating that. And I think we experience some of the problems of that today in culture. The transmission is breaking down, and also in our education. We have to work hard at it.
I love one of the other stresses of the rabbis. They say, what did Moses talk about the night of the Passover? You know, after hundreds of years of slavery, tonight they're going free. But does he talk about freedom? No. They're going to the promised land of milk and honey. The Lord promised them. But does he talk about it? No. What does he talk about? 3 times he talks about children. In other words, Moses tells them how they're to tell the story, because telling the story in families is the secret of identity, and it's also the secret of continuity. And so we need to keep that alive in the church and in our own families.
Yeah, I have a question kind of regarding the more millennial generation or Gen Z, more younger generation coming up. This is a very unique generation. You know, everybody call the millennial generation is the most cause-oriented generation. Yet, you know, the most mission-driven organization in the world, I believe, is the local church and Christian body. That we are having hard time, you know, engaging with the generation and having hard time that really matching our potentials together. Do you have any, what's your observation and thought on that?
Well, Balahu, I hope the Western idea of generation does not go to Mongolia. That is a terrible idea. I call it generationalism. The idea that every generation is radically, radically different. Now, in human history, each generation is just a different pulse beat in humanity. And there's always a link. And of course, children are not quite what their parents are. There are differences, but there's always a link. But through consumerism and marketing, after all, if you want to market new music, new clothes, new cars, you've got to turn over constantly. So this year, different from last year. America introduced the notion in European cars were built well and they lasted. Detroit introduced the idea of the latest year being the latest model. And that slowly came into the generations. So they got smaller and smaller and smaller because they had music to be sold to, clothes to be sold to. Then you had the idea, well, it's a generational thing. You wouldn't understand. So the generations now are cut off from each other. And you have the big problem in America is race. The big problem in Britain is class. But you've also got an age problem. And of course, the Church of Jesus should have the young, the old, the middle-aged, everyone. And you have a high view of the age being wisdom and so on in the Bible. So we've got to undercut generationalism, the idea they're radically different, and make sure, as Dick said, that we're passing it on. You know, did you know, I don't know if you followed the Beijing Olympics in 2008. Incredible Olympics in China. Very close to you in Mongolia. It was the first Olympics in history when there was no American on the relay podium. Now, they happened to have the fastest man in the world that year was Usain Bolt from Jamaica, but that wasn't the reason. The reason was in every one of the relay races, the Americans dropped the baton. And sadly, that's happening in the church. In other words, we've got to pass the baton. We've got to pass faith, discipleship, calling from generation to generation, or a generation arises that's lost. And that's what's happening, as you said, with generation in America, with Generation Z at the moment.
Let's see, Balahu, we can take a bit of an editorial break here. We're right on the hour. And I know we've covered most of our questions, but I think we should see if there's anything else that we'd like to cover.
So only thing, Scott, I can think of probably not covered is actually mentioned in the book about entrepreneurship for life. I think that's very interesting topic because particularly with now the season with COVID and the world is heading toward also the situation in Mongolia. I feel like entrepreneurship it's something that just towards life and business and opportunity are needs to be more encouraged more. So would you mind that maybe bring that question up, and then we can wrap up today's conversation with a final comment or something.
Are you asking me now?
No, Scott, would you, because it was your question on the list.
Oh, sure.
Right.
So I think, Oz, so this one I think is for you. I know that you've talked about under the header of calling, this notion that it's very freeing. And so there's an entrepreneurial spirit that you can bring to how you think about the various things and roles that you can be involved in life. And so could you comment a little or expand a little bit more on that idea of entrepreneurship in life that comes with what we've been talking about in terms of a calling that starts with Christ and then flows out into one's life?
The wonderful thing about our Christian faith is that our Lord is the creator of it all. And he's made us in his image, and we are creative too, with art, music, architecture, and vision in terms of all sorts of things, including business and even politics. So I think as followers of Jesus, we are people who by faith have vision, and we're prepared to pursue a venture, to count the cost, to take the risk, and to go for it. And that's why I think if you look at the whole biblical idea of following Jesus, we're acting into history as his followers, but we're always looking over the horizon, the edge of the horizon, as I said earlier. And so we're doing things we may not see completed, fully successful in our lifetime, but they're worth going for. And as I said, Hebrews 11 tells us the Lord has a city prepared for people who live by faith with that sort of a vision. So we need Christians who are immensely creative, risk-taking, full of venture and vision, and are prepared to go for it. One of our famous sayings in England was, some people see things that are and say, why? Other people see things that are not yet and say, why not? And the Christians should be the second. We're prepared to see things that are new and revolutionary in a biblical sense, and to go for it under the Lord.
Very good. Well, I think as we wrap up, maybe let me go, Dick, to you first, and then to Oz. And are there any final comments as you just reflect across the conversation that we've had? Some final points you'd like to make about calling and its importance?
Well, I might just say that I think, speaking from my own experience, I was late coming to a really robust idea of calling. I sort of worked my way in the back door and found it. I think there's a need to emphasize, as Os just said, the entrepreneurship of faith, the willingness to take risk, not playing it safe. Most things in faith that you talk about in church is circling the wagons, making sure you're correct in every way, theologically, doctrinally, whatever. And those are important, but it sort of somewhat stifles this risk-taking that I think is part of the Christian faith. And I think a lot of people today, a lot of Christians are hunkering down, not thinking of taking risks.
I would just say what a privilege it is to be with you all and to think of you all following Jesus in Mongolia. Calling has been the liberating for me, and you can see in history, whenever it's rediscovered in its biblical depth, there's always an explosion of meaning and Christian engagement in history and in culture. And I hope that will be the same for you in Mongolia. I would just say, when my parents left China in 1955, there were 750 million Christians in China. After 150 or more years of Christian mission, and when my parents came back to Europe, people would say to my father, I remember them saying it, "Henry, I'm so sorry your work has been wasted. The communists have wiped it out." And he would say, well, we had the privilege of sowing the seed. God knows what will happen. Of course, now, all these years later, you can see the church is maybe 100 million strong, and the explosion of the church in China under the Holy Spirit without missionaries is quite extraordinary. So you brothers and sisters in Mongolia, you are part of a worldwide Church of Christ. The Christian church is the biggest faith on the planet Earth. So thank the Lord that you've come to know him at this extraordinary time for humanity and for the world. And I hope each of you knows what it is to play your part in following Jesus in Mongolia. We still go to a little restaurant near here, where for more than a year, there was the most wonderful young Mongolian woman who actually has gone back to Mongolia and came to know Jesus when she was here. So she gives me a sort of personal sense of what it is for you to be Christians in Mongolia. And this has been an incredible privilege for me and for Dick, I know. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, both gentlemen, and also Scott. And it's our privilege to hear your wisdom, your advice, but also receive your blessings as a body of Christ, particularly as a young church. I do know that, the baton will keep on passing in wherever it is. And we'll do our parts, and we'll, in the end of the day, we want to finish strong, and we want to be the generation, just like you said, well done, my servants, and so that we live out our fullest potential to our callings. And thanks again for your time with us and speaking through our podcast and webinar to our leaders in our network. Hope you guys have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be part of it.
Unleash podcast was brought to you by Asia Leadership Development Network. In this podcast, we will discuss topics related to leadership, personal development, family, mental and emotional health, business entrepreneurship, organizational and community leadership, and more. For a better tomorrow, we strive today. Thank you for joining us.